Candy cigarettes were most well known by the kids of the 1960s and the early 70s, before their controversial nature made them retire to the backroom shelves. However, they were a unique product in the sense that, as a candy, they also provided a child's first means of rebellion and mimicry of their parents. Kids didn't really consume them for their taste, but more to stick it to the man. So let's start with the basics, as many claim that the history of candy cigarettes actually began in the rise of candy itself in the 1940s. You see, there was a surge in the candy industry, thanks to modern marvels such as Necco wafers, gumdrops, and pulled creams, and hence candy in the shape of a smoke didn't take so long to appear. Candy cigarettes entirely took off in the American market in the 1920s. By then, tobacco had been commonplace for centuries, but now a new version of smoking had emerged. This was when the Hershey Corporation, which had just begun to capitalize on the newfound chocolate fame, created the chocolate cigarette. Before, they had tried to make various household objects out of candy, including tricycles and toys, but cigarettes were the one that stuck. And it wasn't long before other candy makers like World Candies and Necco began to intimidate Hershey's design, using different types of candy instead. They saw the potential in marketing candy cigarettes for something more durable, like hard candy. Eventually, they found their recipe in a mix of sugar, cornstarch, tapioca, gelatin, and artificial flavor, making a hard candy that could be shaped into a cigarette. Cigarette companies didn't endorse these new candy cigarette brands, but they did use their image and likeness to advertise the product, especially for those who wanted to mimic smoking. As early as 1939, cigarette makers allowed candy companies to copy their branding, even sending them their cigarette pack designs for reference, and it was a win-win for both sides. Cigarette and candy companies saw this as a massive opportunity for marketing tobacco to young consumers who could eventually grow up and someday become a real smoker. This resulted in designs like Viceroy, Winston, Acme, and Marlboro, but in candy form. Or as you may recall from a childhood perspective, Lucky Lights, Kings, and Roundup. Eventually, candy makers began including extra powdered sugar inside the paper wrapping of their candy cigarettes so that it would puff out smoke when the child blew into them. Brands like Just Like Dad use slogans such as "Reach for a pack, just like Dad," to encourage children to imitate their parents. But to be fair, cigarette companies didn't always take their trademark infringement laying down. In 1928, for example, the American Tobacco Company, maker of Lucky Strike cigarettes, took issue with a candy cigarette imitation called Lucky Smokes. Despite the mutually beneficial relationship between the two industries, tensions still started to rise. It all came to a head when a new slogan, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet," began appearing on Lucky Strike ads. Candy companies returned fire with ads that called cigarettes a way to, quote, "poison every organ of your body" with nicotine. Eventually, the FTC stepped in, calling the copycat packaging a form of indirect advertising aimed at children. Other cigarette manufacturers took candy makers to court as well, resulting in the off-branding of all candy cigarette products. Yet, not everyone really understood the drama, as in the 1930s the context was very different from today, as smoking was not widely recognized, as the health hazards were not yet widely known. In fact, some even believed that cigarettes were healthy. And you can't really blame people for thinking that. I mean, during World War II, soldiers were issued cigarettes to, quote, "clean their lungs." But by the 1950s, people began to wake up to the toxins that they inhaled on a daily basis. The first health reports about the dangers of smoking came out sounding the alarm for cigarettes everywhere altogether, including candy cigarettes. Well, not dangerous to eat, they were just so similar to the real thing that parents rightly worried that the product would desensitize their children to smoking and cause them to take up the habit when they were older. Candy smokes were also cheap, often marketed as a penny candy, which was attractive to young consumers with very little money. To make matters worse, the product frequently escaped parents' view because they were usually displayed on the lowest shelves in the shop, right at the exact eye level of the average child. This was such a point of contention that selling candy cigarettes was banned in North Dakota from 1953 to 1967. And the battles continued from 1970 to 1991, when federal lawmakers considered a national ban on the candy altogether. But the tobacco industry had such a strong pull in Congress that it never happened. And although the ban was never formally passed, around this time many companies dropped the word cigarette altogether, branding the confection as, quote, candy sticks. This was a way for candy companies to sell their products while only implying the comparison to cigarettes. And it was also within this period that other candies mimicking tobacco products hit the shelves. In the 1980s, Big League Chew was released in Little League games across the nation. These pouches of shredded bubblegum accurately resembled the chewing tobacco used by major league players. However, massive tobacco settlements in the 1980s also led to more restrictions on advertising and product placement. From there, smoking slowly went out of style and candy cigarettes began to disappear from the stores on their own. By 1997, candy cigarette packs no longer duplicated specific cigarette brands, but the similarities to cigarette packs remained the same. Despite this, World Candies and New England Confectionery, the prominent manufacturers of candy cigarettes at the time, denied the similarities. With that in mind, the question that we need to answer is, do candy cigarettes actually cause children to smoke? Outcry against candy cigarettes has existed since they were first introduced, but it was only when evidence of the harmful effects of tobacco became common knowledge that change would appear. As we said earlier, adults worried that candy cigarettes desensitized children to smoking and made them more likely to smoke as adults, and ultimately, studies proved this notion to be true. Science shows that the earlier a child is exposed to a brand and has a good association with it, the higher a chance they will be a lifelong consumer. This begins in children as young as 3, who are much more impressionable and consuming. And in a sense, this is all about comfort and fun. The actual quality of the project doesn't come into play until they get much older. In other words, children can be swayed by colorful packaging and restaurants with playgrounds, even if the food tastes the same everywhere. It's not that good. Candy cigarettes and products like Big Chew taught kids about the act of consuming tobacco and associated them with good times when they were younger. This is especially troubling since candy cigarettes were primarily consumed by children between the ages of 4 and 8. In fact, in 2007, a University of Rochester study served 25,000 people and found that respondents who consumed candy cigarettes as children were twice as likely to have become smokers later in life. Another study that same year found that children playing with candy cigarettes was rarely benign. They even discovered that it may desensitize children to the harm of actual smoking. The CEO of the Truth Initiative, a nonprofit that educates children about the harmful effects of smoking, explains that anything that normalizes cigarettes is terrible. This is especially true when most smokers start before they've turned 18. The time between a child's first candy cigarette and their first real one is relatively short. At most, it's 15 years before they begin smoking, but for many, it's much shorter than that. Tragically, the average age for a new smoker is 13, so it may only be 5 years before a child goes from candy cigarettes to the real deal. And hence, the consensus has been that the tobacco industry knows this and takes advantage of candy cigarettes as free advertising to potential customers. Candy cigarette companies utilize slogans, packaging cues, and colorful schemes of authentic cigarette brands to groom children and form positive associations with them. Many may have overlooked this, as a 2000 study pointed out that candy cigarette manufacturers have neutralized legal challenges to their product and suppressed information about the dangers. During that time, public health advocates considered candy cigarettes to be an example of how international trademark and copyright laws are violated to promote tobacco to children. This is because both the tobacco and candy industries have viewed candy cigarettes as good advertising to future smokers. People with their hands in both candy and tobacco have denied these claims and argued that restrictions on tobacco products resembling candies are completely unnecessary. But the truth is, there has always been cooperation between tobacco and candy cigarette makers. Tobacco companies have permitted candy companies to use their cigarette pack designs. The trademarks of tobacco brands have been rarely protected in favor of candy cigarettes, with little force, even when they're called out publicly. In 1964, just before the Surgeon General's 1964 report on smoking and health, the National Automatic Merchandising Association's Special Committee on Cigarette Vending wrote to tobacco manufacturers. It had just discovered candy cigarettes in packs, quote, so real-looking it was startling, and was concerned that it would add another argument to bolster the claim that tobacco companies are luring children into smoking. Although dismissed as ridiculous, the committee advised tobacco companies to withdraw permission to use brand names on packaging for candy cigarettes, and this measure would prevent authorization for future use. As a result, the tobacco industry distanced itself from candy cigarettes and withdrew permission from candy manufacturers to copy their designs. However, they continued to allow trademark infringements, but denied this in an Advertising Age article from 1967. As late as 1991, a South American candy company wrote to Philip Morris, reluctantly agreeing not to use their brand's name for their candy cigarettes. They said it was unfair for them to stop producing a beneficial product for the two groups. Altogether, efforts for tobacco companies to stop confectioners from selling candy cigarettes in packages that resemble actual brands has been somewhat minimal. The ineffective trademark enforcement has been characterized by communication of narrow complaints aimed at a single cigarette brand rather than all of a cigarette maker's brands. Acceptance of promises that the infringement would cease with the permission to continue selling the remaining inventory, and vague threats of legal action which were rarely carried out, with insistence on no financial repercussions and a commitment to a, quote, amicable resolution. The only lawsuit to come out of protecting cigarette trademarks from candy use was in 1980, after a New England Journal of Medicine letter went out detailing the phenomenon. In response, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company proclaimed it would end the distribution of candies with their brand names. This was followed by a lawsuit against World Candies for trademark infringement. However, the lawsuit seemed settled before it was even filed. No payment was required for the alleged 30 years of trademark infringement, and further violations were only followed up by letters threatening legal action, with no real action taken. Finally, in 1990, Philip Morris announced a crackdown on children's merchandise bearing its trademarks and made a point by going out of its way to include candy products. Despite this, Philip Morris did not sue before or after the crackdown started. However, and somewhat interestingly, Philip Morris has protected its trademark when it comes to competing tobacco brands, exemplifying its protection of the player's cigarette name and trademark. It was all bluffs and posturing. All the while, there is evidence that children who have used candy cigarettes are more likely to become smokers. In October of 1990, another study found that 6th graders who reported having used candy cigarettes were twice as likely to have smoked real cigarettes, whether or not their parents smoked at all. Additionally, 5 to 11-year-olds in focus groups consistently identified candy cigarettes as, quote, smoking toys, different from candy or snack foods, and said that they or their parents would buy and use them. In November 1990, World Candies contracted Dr. Howard Casanova, a psychologist at Hofstra University, New York, to study the relationship between candy cigarettes and smoking. The cost of the study was split between World Candies and New England Confectionery. In January of 1991, the doctor and his colleagues produced a 2-part study that World Candies funded in response to a bill from the House of Representatives to ban candy cigarettes that were being considered in Congress. In the first part, the study found that 5.3% of adult smokers considered candy cigarettes consumed in their youth to have contributed to their later smoking. The second part of the study had candy cigarettes shown to 31 young children and observed their reactions. The conclusion was that children identified the confectionery as candy cigarettes due to its packaging features such as size, shape, and design. Labeling it cigarette or not had little effect. This leaves no doubt that some of the children were pretending to smoke while using the candy. Given the known health risks of smoking, the doctor and his colleagues recommended that the makers of candy cigarettes package their candy in a way that is not similar to real cigarettes, and hence World Candies and the New England Confectionery changed their packaging, but it was different from what the research recommended. Ultimately, they only removed the word cigarettes from its packaging. Even though they already knew it had little effect from the study they funded, otherwise, their packaging remained the same, and it was quite complete, as far as adding simulated tax stamps. After the Hofstra study was delivered to World Candies, the company contracted the doctor who revised his report. In this new revised version, all references to candy cigarette quote usage reflecting use as a smoking toy were replaced with the word eating to suggest it was like any other food. But it gets much worse. References to the health hazards of smoking, the ban being considered by Congress, the descriptions of studies critical to candy cigarettes, and a list of all the countries that had banned them were deleted. These countries included Australia, Canada, Finland, Kuwait, Norway, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as the United Kingdom. The study also didn't mention the 5.3% of adults who considered candy cigarettes to have contributed to their smoking habit. Instead of lumping them together with other factors in the quote 5% or less category, most notably, all references to the observations of children mimicking adult smokers and researchers concerned about the design features suggestive of tobacco cigarettes were also deleted. All in all, the original study, which started at 76, was reduced to just 31 points. In February of 1991, the president of the New England Confectionery sent World Candies half the cost of the study and commented that he believed they could get, quote, some mileage from this report and convince some of our legislators on their Capitol Hill appearance. This led to the suppression of information by the candy industry, as well as discoveries found in the study, and this tampered information was used to justify that candy cigarettes were harmless. And now, as shocking as this might all sound, the situation was not unique. In fact, this is just a practical approach to lobbying against legislation and regulation, practices that are used far outside of the case of candy cigarettes. Anyhow, these methods were described in 1996 by the Legal Counsel of New England Confectionery, as well as World Candies. You see, when a proposed ban first surfaces, lobbyists are hired to expand the language and dismiss the proposed ban as ridiculous and unworthy of attention by public officials. By this period, the bill sinks and candy cigarettes escape regulation. Ridicule also plays a role in defeating bans, with the candy companies sending the altered study as an argument against the legislators' points. Candy cigarettes are portrayed as harmless fun and a part of growing up, so bans against them have been framed as government overstepping and intruding on individual rights. In November 1988, a settlement between the tobacco industry and 46 state attorney generals was reached. And since then, candy cigarettes have been much more challenging to find, and beyond the US, they have been outright banned in countries like Brazil, Ireland, and Turkey. In 2009, the US finally banned candy cigarettes under the FDA's Family Smoking Prevention and Control Act. This decision was made with information from these studies showing that the confection led to cigarette use and the belief that eliminating them would help reduce tobacco use in young people. Despite this, candy cigarettes, or quote, candy sticks as disguised today, can still be bought in stores alongside Big League Chew, bubblegum cigars, and licorice pipes. While they may not have the effect or popularity they once did, candy cigarettes certainly left their mark on society and exposed the dangers of letting an industry run wild, especially when it comes to the safety of children. And perhaps somewhat naively, before making this video, I can admit to having never realized the trouble that candy cigarettes caused, as I myself have enjoyed many a candy cigarette in my day. I imagine that your story might not be any different, and I'd be curious to hear your reflections on that matter in the comment section below. Otherwise, I thank you so much for watching and subscribing. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.